Okay, let's take our seats. Okay, welcome everybody to the South Atlantic State Federal Fisheries Management Board. My name is Pat Gear from Virginia, and as always, we seem to be rounding out the meeting week, so let's try to get this done as soon as possible because we've got a lot of people that want to get on the road and start traveling. First of all, the agenda, approval of the agenda. Are there any changes to the agenda? Chris?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's probably already on staff's radar, but at the end, if we could, I guess, consider the advisory panel nomination that was in the supplemental materials.
Okay. I believe that was in our materials, but it was not listed on the agenda, and we'll add that on there. And I guess Tina will be in the room for that one. Are there any other changes or modifications to the agenda? Any objections? Seeing none, the agenda is approved by consent. Moving on to the proceedings from the August meeting, any additions, modifications? Hearing none, the proceedings are approved by consent. Is there any public comment from anything that is not on the agenda? We didn't have anybody sign up. Okay, moving right along. Item number 4, review of the public comment for the summary of the Kobe Draft Amendment 1 for the public information document. We had several public meetings that weren't very well attended, and Mike will tell you about that. So, Dr. Schminke, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. All right, so I will be going through the summary of public comment for the public information document for Draft Amendment 1 to the Atlantic Cobia Fishery Management Plan. Before I get into the PID topics and public comment, just a quick reminder of the timeline that we're working on for this draft amendment. Today, the board will review public comment and provide direction for the PDT to develop Draft Amendment 1, and that is scheduled to be reviewed for public comment in May of next year and ultimately considered for approval in August of next year using that current timeline. At the last board meeting, public information document for Draft Amendment 1 to the Interstate Cobia FMP was released for public comment. The PID stated the need for an amendment to the FMP to continue management of Atlantic cobia in the absence of a federal FMP. In order to accomplish this, language for several measures originally written as complementary to the Coastal Migratory Pelagics FMP needs to be changed, and a board recommendation for management by NOAA Fisheries in federal waters should be developed. Additionally, the board expressed desire to consider different management strategies through this amendment as well. The PID outlined and requested public comment on 3 main issues: recommended management for federal waters, establishment of a harvest specification process, and biological monitoring requirements. Written comments were received through October 10th of this year. We received 39 written comments, the majority of which were submitted as signatures to a form letter from the Virginia Saltwater Sport Fishing Association. 6 public hearings were held for New Jersey and jurisdictions from Maryland through Georgia. A total of 10 public attended these meetings, with 0 public attending a joint hearing for PRFC in Maryland and the North Carolina hearing held in Morehead City. A conference call was held for the AP. Response to the doodle poll requesting availability for this call was limited, and only 2 members joined that call. The members that were unable to attend were encouraged to submit comments via email, but no additional comments were received in that media. No comments were provided on the AP call. One of the attendees did not desire to provide comments, and the other was satisfied with previously submitted written and spoken comments that were given at the Virginia hearing. It's possible that the timing of the storms that happened late this summer across the Southeast may have had some impact on the participation there. But as you can see, it was fairly low participation for hearings as well as the AP call. Several current policies were supported for continuation by all or nearly all of the comments that were submitted. These include current coastwide minimum size and bag limits, the process for allowing states to adjust vessel limits and seasons to achieve their recreational harvest targets, the 3-year harvest evaluation process for the recreational fishery, use of a coastwide commercial quota and recreational harvest target, and current allocation percentages for the coastwide RHL. Comments on recommended management for federal waters were split geographically. The majority of comments coming from Virginia and North Carolina supported management based on regulations of the state of landing, whereas comments that came from South Carolina supported management based on latitudinal extension of state boundaries into the EEZ. There was also some support from South Carolina stakeholders for zoning off certain areas of the EEZ for specific regulations. The majority of comments on potential harvest specification process supported a 3-year time period for evaluating and specifying recreational harvest, and some form of multi-year time period for evaluating and specifying commercial harvest. Nearly all comments supported evaluation of recreational harvest in numbers rather than pounds, and several comments expressed concern with differences in regulations between commercial and recreational sectors, especially those that would potentially lead to recreational fishermen having higher vessel limits than commercial fishermen. A couple of topics concerning harvest specification had comments that were also split geographically. The majority of comments from Virginia and North Carolina desired stability in annual fishing regulations with no board ability to make in-season changes. And they also supported continuation of the current coastwide recreational maximum vessel limit of 6 fish. The majority of comments from South Carolina supported the board's ability to react quickly to changes in the fishery and consideration of a lower coastwide recreational maximum vessel limit, specifically suggesting 3 or 4 fish as that vessel limit. The majority of comments supported voluntary but not mandatory biological monitoring programs. The states from Florida through Georgia all have some form of sampling program in place currently through their state agencies. So there was a general opinion that these programs were adequate and should continue, but not become requirements that would burden the states or individual fishers in those states. Several comments outside of the issues of the PID were also submitted. These included establishment of cobia regulations in all areas of the management area from Georgia through New York. Most states this has already been accomplished. I'm not sure if New York has regulations in place for cobia right now. The comments also wanted inclusion of the east coast of Florida in the management area or shifting of some amount of quota from the east coast of Florida to the current management area. And additionally, specifically for Virginia, there were comments requesting a change in the commercial regulations from a per license holder limit to a per vessel limit. As a note to that second point concerning the east coast of Florida, because Florida is not currently in the management area of the interstate FMP, cobia in that area are managed by the South Atlantic Council. And any inclusion or shifting of quota from the east coast of Florida cannot be initiated by the Commission. That would have to be initiated by the Council in order to accomplish that. So the most the Commission would be able to do in that regard is send some form of letter, but the Council would have to transfer that over to the Commission in some form. So at that point, I can pause and take any questions on the public comment portion, and then I do have a couple additional slides as far as asking for the board's direction on writing of the document.
Thank you very much, Mike. Are there any questions for Mike? I'm not seeing any hands go up. All right, Mike. Move on.
So in providing direction for the development of the draft amendment document, I've condensed some of the issues that were brought up through public comment into categories of policies that were generally supported for continuation from the current FMP. These may not need to be included in the draft draft amendment 1. They can just be carried over from the initial FMP. Then the second slide will show those that need to be included due to the removal of cobia from the federal FMP. And finally, those policies that had multiple opinions or would pose potential changes to the current FMP. So here we see a list of current policies that were generally supported for continuation. These include the recreational minimum size and bag limits, use of a coast-wide commercial quota, use of a coast-wide recreational harvest target allocated to non-de minimis states and evaluated as 3-year averages with state ability to set seasons and vessel limits to achieve the allocated targets, and current recreational allocation percentages. Items that need to be addressed by Draft Amendment 1 include a recommendation for federal waters with options of regulations by state of landing or regulations by fishing location in some form, either with the state regulations extended latitudinally or some form of zoning off of the EEZ with regulations in certain areas. Additionally, another topic that needs to be addressed is how harvest regulations will be specified in the absence of a federal FMP. Right now, the commercial quota as well as the recreational harvest limit are both tied to federal ACLs that will be taken away once the federal FMP, once cobia is removed from the federal FMP. If a harvest specification process is established, then options must be chosen that define which measures are subject to board specification without action through an amendment or addendum, as well as how frequently the board will be specifying these measures. Finally, there are issues that would be changes or additions to the current FMP that could be considered for inclusion in Draft Amendment 1. These issues are not tied to the federal FMP, so exclusion of any of them would still allow the Commission to manage under current policies in the absence of a federal FMP. These include biological monitoring requirements. These would be in addition. In consideration of the comments that were submitted and the already established state programs, one route to go with the biological monitoring topic is to include some statement in the draft FMP that would encourage continuation of state programs and state their value to evaluating stock health, but not make them requirements of the plan. Additionally, several changes to current measures were proposed through comments and could be considered for inclusion, such as changes to the coastwide maximum vessel limit, commercial size, possession, or vessel limits, and evaluation of recreational harvest in numbers or pounds. So now I would look to the board for direction on what issues that are listed here or otherwise should be included in the draft amendment, as well as potential options for these issues. Additionally, along with asking for direction from the board, I also have a brief note on the composition of the plan development team. We currently have technical representatives from 3 states, 2 SES members, and a South Atlantic Council staff member. As we move into the document development portion of this process, it would be helpful to have additional PD team members with more of a policy background, potentially a couple or a few board members to help in constructing the management options.
Thank you, Mike. Why don't we start with that last portion first? Are there any, John?
Sorry, just more of clarification on that minimum size. You weren't including the de minimis minimum size because it's still 29 inches, right, in the plan for de minimis states?
That's what it is. Nobody really commented on the de minimis minimum size. Most of the comments were saying that they would want continuation of the 36-inch minimum size for the recreational. Unless there's some, request for the board to that be included in the draft amendment, that would be carried over.
Okay. Are any of the board members present today, would they be interested in sitting on the plan? I'm seeing someone being nominated, but I don't see him raising his hand, so I'm not sure I want to go there but I will probably sit on it, but if anyone else is interested, let me know, let us know. So, I see.
I will.
I see Mr. Woodward being reluctantly volunteered, and Chris Savage as well. That's great. I think that's more than enough at this point, unless if anyone else wants to. Joe's shaking his head no, which that's okay. I think 3 would be a good number. I think it's. But if anyone else has any input on that or wants to join us in that process, we greatly appreciate it. So that's probably more than enough at this point. That's great. All right. So at this point, if there's any comments or any questions we have, I see Joe has his hand raised up. So Joe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mike, can you go back one slide to? So the I lived Cobia for a while, and that evaluation of the recreational fishery in numbers and pounds is a big and somewhat complicated issue that I think has been well looked into at this point. But I am a little bit, hesitant that that's something that we need public input on. I think really that's a board consideration that has a technical committee recommendation. It's just a thought, but.
So if that is something that the board would want in the amendment, then that can, be part of the amending process, or that can, I guess I would just need direction from the board that that's going to be how the fishery is evaluated from that point forth, even if it's not put forth, as a public issue. The PDT would still need direction that would be included.
That seems, as Joe said, the TC, that was the recommendation from the TC, and if there's no objections from the board, that's probably the way we should go, and not even making an option when we're developing the plan. Just say that we want these assessed, monitored by numbers instead of pounds. I've seen nodding of the head, so, okay. And I see, I'll go with Chris, and then I've got Lynn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the federal waters management issue, we heard comments from the board and the public about either making cobia harvest in federal waters subject to the state where you're from or fishing from, or extending the state jurisdictional boundaries by latitude into federal waters. As far as an option, is it possible that we can have one that does both, meaning like the southern states have an option where the latitudinal boundaries are extended out, and in the northern states where it may not be feasible to do that, you hold the vessels to whatever limit that they fished out of. So it's kind of an option where both. It was pretty clear from the comments that there was 2 different options depending on where people were on the coast, and I think we're all trying to get to the same place, which is we don't want different federal measures than what we have in the state, but maybe have 2 different methods of doing that depending on where we are along the coast. Just a thought as far as whether that's something feasible to explore as an option.
I think the feasibility, theoretically it sounds like that's something that we could develop as an option. I would think that we would probably want to get some law enforcement input on that. That would probably be the biggest question, biggest source of answers, I guess, for the feasibility issue, because you're going to have those varying requirements by, location or who's fishing, things like that. But that's something that we can include and try to take forward with future discussions.
And Chris, I think that what that would be is it would be a third option. You know, it'd be, we have option 1, option 2, and a combination of 1 and 2, which we can put forth in the plan. And then I have Lynn.
Yeah, thank you. Just to follow along John's comment, I just would like to approach with some care how we handle the de minimis states. You know, we kind of threw that little bit of a Hail Mary where we were able to take on whatever regulations that Virginia did, which was really a lifesaver for our charter fleet. If we had wound up with 1 fish per vessel per day, it would have been kind of tough when the Virginia fleet has more liberal rules. So that really was helpful, and I would just say that as we go forward, if we can take care to address the de minimis states and allow them some ability, a little bit of flexibility as we did under the current plan, that would be good.
All right, thank you, Lynn. Are there any more? I see Spud.
Yeah, I thought maybe it'd be good just to kind of remind everybody, as the state that's living on the border with Florida, I mean, we're already dealing with the fact that we have a latitudinal boundary extending out into the EEZ. I mean, you've got, that's the dividing line between the Atlantic group and Gulf group. You've got a 33-inch minimum size limit for the Gulf group. I believe that's correct. And then we now have a 36-inch minimum size limit in Georgia. So we're already dealing with situations where we routinely have fishermen that leave a point of origin, go into a whole completely different regulatory jurisdiction, and either, you know, they've got to resolve that. And I mean, the way we've always treated it in Georgia is, you know, when you landed in Georgia, you're bound by whatever Georgia's regulations are, and vice versa, same way in Florida. I mean, you know, so I mean, we've already done that. I mean, we've already got latitudinal extensions. Now the problem becomes, you know, if you start dividing that at every state border, you know, is this going to get into some unwieldy, really cumbersome problem or not? But I guess it should be considered. Although I've always been a fan of wherever you land it, that's what you're bound by.
Thank you, Spud. Are there any more comments or any more discussion or additions you want to see moving forward? I mean, I kind of think the boundary issue is going to be something that's going to be discussed further, and I think that's something that's, when we move into this and we sit down back in May and discuss the plan, that's probably going to be one of our largest discussion items, because I know, you know, nobody's here from South Carolina, but I know how they feel about it as well. And I think it's, you know, it would, you know, Chris provided a third option, which is a possibility, and it's like, you know, as Spud just said, it might be, if we can all come to some consensus on that, that would be great. But we'll develop the plan and see what comes up with that. Hearing no other additions to this, we don't have to do an action on this. No, I do have. Mike has one more thing. I'm sorry.
So I guess I just wanted to get some, I guess, explicit direction to include or not include. So example, the items that are listed as examples, those are things that the public commented on. We received comments on those. So are there any board members that want the coast-wide maximum vessel limit or the commercial size possession or vessel limit, any of those items to be included and up for changing through this draft amendment?
See, Doug's hand went up.
Well, I am interested in seeing the commercial size limit brought up to the minimum recreational size limit. So I definitely would want that one included.
Chris?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. I think that's a good option to include the possession or vessel limit for the commercial fishery. I think is also a good one to at least consider at this point, especially when, at least under the current ACL, we keep hitting the having to close the commercial fishery early. So I don't know if this would be an opportunity to try to avoid these early closures, try to ration out that catch limit to avoid regulatory discards later in the fall.
And then also for the biological monitoring portion, the impression that I've gotten from talking to folks is that they would rather not see that as a requirement, but, you know, possibly some statement in the draft amendment that says, we hope that these programs continue their valuable sources of information for evaluating stock health. Is that the will of the board to just have that as more of an encouragement and not a requirement?
I'm seeing the nodding heads on that, and I would tend to agree. I see Lynn's hand come up.
Yeah, I definitely agree. As a de minimis state, we would probably fall under that anyway, but I think it would be tough to implement another monitoring program. But I did want to ask, so would that encouragement of collection also include collections for genetic analysis? Is that something it's worth, you know, I know there's been a lot of conversation about where these fish in Chesapeake Bay are coming from. So it'd be kind of, if that's something that we want to do, to include that and encourage states to get some genetic samples when they can.
I can include that. That wasn't the original motivation of the thought behind biological requirements. The original thought was, if we shift over to managing in numbers, what if the average weight changes? How are we going to be able to notice that the weights are changing, and, you know, that may be indicative of some problems in the stock. But I think that that's, you know, since it's not becoming a requirement, we can add that other, you know, sources of information that would be useful going forward would be additional information on, like, stock identification, things of that nature.
Anything else? Okay, hearing nothing. Thank you, everyone, for your input on that. All right, moving forward, we're in the home stretch. We're going to hear from Mike on plan review and status compliance reports on black drum, spotted sea trout, and Spanish mackerel.
Okay, so we have a suite of F&P reviews to go through. This may get repetitive by the last one. I apologize for that, but I will try to keep it as brief as possible. First, we'll go through the Black Drum 2018 F&P review. In July of this year, as all of you are aware, MRIP recalibrated recreational harvest estimates from the telephone survey to the mail survey. Here you see a comparison of the recreational harvest by these two different calibrations, and that's for black drum. On average, the FES calibration increased estimates by about 4 times. As this species is not managed based on the weight of recreational harvest, or recreational harvest as a total quota, the recreational estimates shown today will use the FES survey. But it should be noted that the last assessment for black drum did use the telephone survey estimates and will need to be updated in the future. These graphs, the following graphs represent black drum harvest within the management unit from New Jersey to Florida. They do not include landings outside of that area. Total landings throughout the time series are heavily recreational and range up to 11 million pounds in 2008. 2017 landings were 6.6 million pounds, which is a small decrease from 2016. Commercial landings have been low and fairly consistent throughout the time series, with composing 4% of the total in 2017 at 294,000 pounds. Excuse me. This was a 35% increase from 2016. And North Carolina harvested the majority of the commercial landings at 62%. Recreational harvest has fluctuated pretty widely, but without much of a long-term trend since 2000. Harvest in 2017 was 6.3 million pounds, or 1.7 million fish. That is a 5% decrease by weight and a 15% decrease by numbers from 2016. Florida harvested the majority of recreational landings by weight at 65% and by numbers at 60%. The percentage of recreational releases has increased drastically throughout the time series. Over the last 4 years, over 70% of the recreational catch has been released, and that really coincides with the establishment of the black drum FMP. In 2017, 78% of recreational catch, or 6 million fish, was released. This is an increase by both number and percentage from 2016. Recreational discard mortality is estimated at 8%. This amounts to about 486,000 dead recreational discards. The last benchmark stock assessment for this species was done in 2015. The median biomass was well above what's needed to produce maximum sustainable yield. The median overfishing limit from this assessment was 4.12 million pounds. Just as a reminder, this is using telephone survey recreational estimates. This assessment determined that the stock is not overfished nor experiencing overfishing. The 5-year trigger for the next assessment is coming up in 2020, and so the plan review team did want to put that on the board's radar for future consideration in the stock assessment schedule. Black drum is currently managed under the original FMP. Earlier this year, the first addendum to this FMP was approved. That addendum allowed Maryland to reopen their commercial fishery in the Chesapeake Bay. Here we see a table that's shown in Table 1 of the report. It has the state measures in it. All states met the possession and size limits required by the FMP in 2017. The plan review team found all states in compliance with the FMP. States are able to request de minimis, but no states requested de minimis this year through the annual reporting process. So the PRT recommends that the board approve the 2018 Black Drum FMP review and state compliance reports. There are additional recommendations for management, research, and monitoring in the FMP review report. And also the PRT would recommend that the board schedule an assessment or update in coinciding with the 2020 trigger that's coming up. Hopefully that this assessment update would incorporate recalibrated MRIP estimates. And with that, I'll take questions.
Any questions or comments from Mike? Okay, we're going to do each one of these motions separately because they've been written that way. So we're going to have a motion to approve this. And let's go, Lynn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move to accept the 2018 FMP review and state compliance reports for black drum.
Okay, I need a second from John Clark. Any objection? Any discussion? Hearing none, I'll read the motion. Move to accept the 2018 FMP review and state compliance report for black drum. Motion by Ms. Fagley and seconded by Mr. Clark. Hearing no objection, approved by consent. Let's move on to spotted sea trout.
So now we'll go through the spotted sea trout FMP review for 2018. Here we see another figure of the MRIP calibrations for the telephone and mail-based surveys. This for spotted sea trout. The FES calibration on average increased estimates by about 3 times. And again, as this species is not managed based on total recreational landings in a given year, the estimates that are presented today will be used. We'll use the FES survey. The assessments that are done for spotted sea trout are generally done by the states, so the PRT would give a recommendation that states in future assessments conduct those using the FES estimates. Here we see a figure of landings for the commercial and recreational fisheries for spotted sea trout. Total landings in 2017 were 7.3 million pounds. That is an 18% increase from 2016. Commercial landings were 371,000 pounds. North Carolina harvested the majority of those at 81%. Commercial landings have shown a gradual decline since about the 1980s. Here we see recreational harvest and as well as releases and catch. Harvest is shown in red, and as you can see, that's been about stable throughout the time series with a 3.5 million fish average. 2017 harvest was 4 million fish, or about 7 million pounds. This is a 10 to 15% increase from last year, and North Carolina and Georgia had the largest recreational harvests. Recreational releases have increased since the 1980s, but without much of a trend since about the mid-2000s. Well, since about the mid-2000s. 82% of recreational catch was released in 2017, and that is about the same proportion as has been released on average over the last 10 years. Due to the disproportionate number of releases versus harvest, the trends in recreational catch largely follow those of releases, increasing since the 1980s and annually fluctuating but about stable for the past 10 years. In 2017, 22 million fish were caught recreationally, and that is approximately the same as what was caught in 2016. There is no coastwide stock assessment for spotted sea trout due to their life history and lack of migration between areas, as well as data availability in certain portions of their range. But several state assessments have been conducted. The most recent assessment that was completed was finalized in this year for Florida. That had data going through 2016. That determined that the Northeast Florida and Southeast Florida populations were above the biomass threshold, but below the target biomass, and overfishing was not occurring in either of those areas. Table 1 in the report shows the various state regulations for spotted sea trout. De minimis can be requested by states for spotted sea trout, and it's calculated as a 3-year average of the total landings. States that will qualify have less than 1% of the total landings. New Jersey and Delaware both requested de minimis, and both states qualify for this designation. The plan review team found all states to be in compliance with the FMP, with all of them establishing at least a 12-inch minimum total length size limit. So the PRT recommends that the board approve the 2018 FMP review, state compliance reports, and de minimis status for New Jersey and Delaware. There are additional research and monitoring recommendations that are in the FMP review report as well. And I can take questions on spotted sea trout.
Any questions for Mike? No comments? Okay, I'll entertain a motion on this. I have Chris.
See if they have one up on the board. Here we go. Thanks. Move to accept the 2018 FMP review and state compliance reports for spotted sea trout and approve de minimis requests for New Jersey and Delaware.
I have a second by John Clark. Any other discussion? Any other objections? I'll read the motion. Move to accept the 2018 FMP review and state compliance reports for spotted sea trout and approve the de minimis requests for New Jersey and Delaware. Motion by Mr. Beth Savage and seconded by Mr. Clark. And we heard no objections and no other comments, so approved by consent. Okay, moving along.
All right, last FMP review for the day is for Spanish mackerel. Here's the calibration comparison for Spanish mackerel. Unlike the other two species that I've talked about today, Spanish mackerel is managed based on an annual quota that includes recreational weight. So the units that are going to be shown in all of the figures today are still using the telephone survey, and the telephone survey will be used moving forward until that species is assessed again. And that next assessment is scheduled for 2020. Total landings of Spanish mackerel in 2017 were 4.2 million pounds. This was a 200,000 pound decrease from 2016 and below the most recent 10-year average. The commercial fishery accounted for 80% of the 2017 total. This was on the high end for a commercial percentage, but it's not atypical for the composition of the total catch between sectors. The switch over to the FES estimates would change the typical catch composition to be about 50-50, with 2017 being about 60% commercial. Commercial harvest outside of 2010 and 2011 has been below 4 million pounds since 1995. This was when Florida banned entanglement nets. Florida is historically the largest commercial harvester. Coastwide commercial harvest in 2017 was 3.5 million pounds. This was a 300,000 pound increase from 2016. Florida had the largest commercial harvest at 76%, and North Carolina had 24%. 2017 recreational landings were 632,000 Spanish mackerel, or 751,000 pounds. This was a 44% decrease in numbers from 2016. North Carolina landed the greatest percentage of fish with 61%, and Florida was second with 29%. The releases have generally increased over time, but they've leveled off for the past 20 or 25 years. In 2017, 38% of the recreational catch, or 391,000 fish, were released. The most recent stock assessment for Spanish mackerel was in 2012. This assessment determined the stock is not overfished nor experiencing overfishing. The next assessment is scheduled through the CDAR process for 2020, and this will include the updated MRIP estimates. Spanish mackerel is primarily managed by the South Atlantic Council. The Commission manages in cooperation with the Council currently through the Omnibus Amendment to the Spanish mackerel FMP. In 2013, Addendum 1 introduced a pilot program that allows states to reduce the minimum size in their commercial pound net fishery from July to September. This program has been used and extended for North Carolina through the 2018 fishing year. No state regulatory changes occurred in 2017. South Atlantic Council and the Gulf Council passed Framework Amendment 5 to the Coastal Migratory Pelagics FMP. This impacts permitting regulations but does not influence the regulatory measures of the interstate FMP. The PRT finds that all states have implemented the requirements of the FMP. New Jersey, Delaware, and Georgia have requested de minimis status, and they qualify with a 3-year average total landings that are less than 1% of the coastwide total. So the PRT recommends that the board approve the 2018 Spanish mackerel FMP review, state compliance reports, and de minimis status for New Jersey, Delaware, and Georgia. There are additional research and monitoring requirements in the FMP review report. And I'll take questions on Spanish mackerel.
Any questions or comments from Mike? Hearing none. We need a motion. Spud?
All right. Give me something to read. Move to accept the 2018 FMP review and state compliance reports for Spanish mackerel and approve de minimis requests for New Jersey, Delaware, and Georgia.
Second by Tom Foti. All right. Are there any further discussion on this? Any objection? I'll read the motion. Move to accept the 2018 FMP review and state compliance report for Spanish mackerel and approve de minimis requests for New Jersey, Delaware, and Georgia. Motion by Mr. Woodward and seconded by Mr. Foti. Hearing no objection, motion is carried by consent. And moving on to hopefully our last item is the AP nomination. Tina?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have one AP member for your consideration and approval to the South Atlantic Species AP, and that's Glenn Skinner, a commercial gill netter from North Carolina.
Okay. All right, and that is Mr. Skinner, right? Chris, do you want to add anything about that, about him?
Glenn Skinner is, I think, would be a strong AP member. He is a gill netter targeting spotted sea trout and Spanish mackerel, so it's kind of rounding out some of the species in the South Atlantic board that we could always use some more representation on. So with that, I'd make a motion to approve Glenn Skinner, to approve the nomination of Glenn Skinner to the South Atlantic Advisory Panel.
Okay. Second motion by Jim Estes. Any further discussion? Any objection? We'll consider the motion carried as by consent. Is there any other business to come forth this board at this time? Jack?
Hey, Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to update you on the secretarial review of Coastal Migratory Pelagic Amendment 31 that removes Atlantic cobia from the federal plan, and the notice of availability for that amendment published on October 11th, and the comment period ends on December 10th, and we expect the proposed rule to publish probably next week on that, and that'll have a 30-day comment period, and that's it.
Okay. Thank you, Jack. Is there anything else? Any other comments? Take a motion to adjourn. I see hands going up. We are adjourned, and thank you very much, and everyone have safe travels home.